Next, we're going to tackle the problem of evil. Now, don't get your hopes up. I don't expect that we're actually going to get very far because theologians have been trying to solve the problem of evil for a very, very long time. Some people don't like the word evil, and it's a question of whether evil is actually real. That's one of the things that we'll be discussing. Some people prefer to use the word suffering. Some people might think that evil is not real, but suffering is. Either way, whether we're talking about evil or whether we're talking about suffering, we're talking about the aspect of theology that is concerned with theodicy. Theodicy is a fancy word, but it really means theo, the divine, God, and justice, dice. In other words, how do we explain the justice of the divine when there is evil and suffering in the world? Now, like I said, theologians and religious teachers of all stripes have been trying to figure this out for a very, very long time. And it's not an easy question. Philosophers thousands of years ago came up with what we call the impossible triangle. So the impossible triangle has three sides. God is all good, God is all powerful, and evil or suffering is real. The problem is that you can't really hold all three at the same time and be logically consistent, or at least it's very, very difficult. For instance, if God, or the divine, were all good, then God would want to stop evil because evil causes suffering. If God were good, God would not want people to suffer. So, if God is all-powerful, if God has the power to stop evil or to stop suffering, and God is good, then God would stop evil and suffering. And yet for some reason, there is still evil and suffering in the world. How do we explain this? Well, that is exactly the problem and the question that theologians have been chasing their tails over for a couple thousand years. Like I said, we're not going to get to the bottom of it today, but we can explore some of the polarities involved. What is evil? Is it a real thing, or is it just a label that we put on things that we don't like? Why do bad things happen to good people? That doesn't seem like justice to most of us. How do we resist evil in ourselves or in other people? Or at least how do we reduce its power or its effect? These are all very good questions. One of the polarities that we might draw in discussing this question is divinity good or not good? Because if the divine is all-powerful, but the divine is not all good, then there really isn't a problem with the fact that there's evil and suffering in the world. A not good God would allow evil. Also, the question of whether the divine is all-powerful has bearing here too. And we've already done that polarity also when we discussed the nature of ultimate reality. Is the divine all-powerful or not all-powerful? Because a God who is all good but not all-powerful, well, if we have a God like that, it's easy to understand why there might be evil and suffering in the world. A God like that would not like the fact that there is evil, would not want evil to be in the world, but might not be able to stop it. And then, of course, you might have an all-good God who is all-powerful, but who doesn't stop evil and suffering because evil and suffering simply aren't real. They are perhaps illusions, and if illusions, not really a problem. All of these are possibilities, and remember that we are discussing the range and the realm of possibilities in this class. So let's explore this question of whether evil is real a little more. On one side of this continuum, we have the reality of evil, or that suffering is real. And on the other side, that evil is an illusion, or of course suffering is an illusion. If we're talking about native traditions, generally, we would hold that evil is real, and that beings actually do suffer, that beings are real, and that their suffering is actual. Zoroastrianism would agree with this. Zoroastrianism is actually very concerned with the problem of evil and sees the whole universe as a battle between good and evil. Judaism, which has a lot in common actually with both native traditions and Zoroastrianism, would agree with this. Evil is real and so is suffering. Christianity and Islam, which came out of or was deeply influenced by Judaism, would agree with this. For Taoism, though, it's a little different. I put Taoism further on the side of evil being an illusion, simply because in Taoism, things simply are what they are. Both Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu said that things are neither good nor bad, but people simply call them one or the other. That good and bad are simply labels that have their origin not in the nature of things, but really in the human imagination. But what about Hinduism? Well, in Hinduism, evil and suffering are both illusions because the only thing that is real is the divine. Everything else is a part of the divine, or a huge illusion that the divine is spinning out. So evil and suffering aren't really a problem in Hinduism because they don't really exist. For Buddhism, too, evil is illusory. And suffering, especially in Buddhism, is a product of the mind. New Thought would agree with this, coming very close to the Buddhist position of evil and suffering being a product of the human imagination. Let's return to the whole question of justice now. If God or the gods are not just, then that has some bearing on why there may or may not be evil or suffering in the world as well. Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam very much posit a moral deity, a just God. In Hinduism, I put it a little more in the middle, because different sects of Hinduism would come down differently on this question. And some would agree with Taoism that questions of good and evil, or justice or injustice, are human inventions and really can't apply to the deity. For native traditions, their gods don't have to be just In fact, many of them are unjust. The mythology of native traditions are replete with all kinds of divine characters doing things that we would not consider to be terribly godly. It's one of the reasons why we love them so much. They remind us a lot of us. Speaking of us, are we basically good or basically evil? Again, this is a very complicated question, and different traditions have different answers for this. Native traditions would, by and large, agree that human beings being part of nature, and nature being basically good, are basically good. Human beings are basically good. Zoroastrianism would agree with this. In Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda, the wise god, made all things and made them to be good, made a good earth, and made humans to be part of it. Judaism would agree with this assessment. So would Islam. And, in fact, so would Hinduism. For Buddhism, however, I put it in the middle. Because, again, there is this ambiguity in Buddhism and Taoism about what is good and what is bad. That these categories are largely the inventions of the human imagination. Confucianism, likewise, comes down in the middle, seeing human nature as basically neutral. However, one prominent Confucius thinker, Sun Tzu, comes down very strongly on the side of human nature being basically bad. Orthodox Christianity, like most of Taoism and Confucianism, is kind of in the middle. Human beings are born with a clean slate, neither good nor bad, but morally neutral. Orthodox Christianity would affirm, however, that evil exists in the world kind of like a virus, and most people catch it pretty early. Catholic Christianity, however, has a very pessimistic view of human nature, largely deriving from St. Augustine's philosophy, that, well, in a nutshell, human beings are just born bad and get worse from there. Protestant Christianity, which owes a lot to Augustinian thinking, would agree.
I think people are just plain bad. That's why I prefer the company of dogs.
You don't know my dog.
Did you hear that Pope Francis said that animals can go to heaven?
Yeah, my dog was gloating about that the other day. I told him, too bad you are evil.
Time to reflect for yourself. Please write one paragraph about how you understand evil or suffering. Again, please be brief. Only spend a sentence or two on each of the following. First, is evil real, or is suffering real? You can answer both or either. Also, why do bad things happen to good people? Third, are people basically good or bad at heart? And fourth, how do you explain the amount of evil or suffering in the world?
We'll be spending a lot more time with theodicy, the problem of evil and suffering, in our upcoming modules.
So stay tuned.
The next area of theology for us to look at is called eschatology. This really is the area of study where we talk about the end of things. Eschatology comes from, again, a Greek word that's a combination of two other Greek words. One is eschaton, which simply means the end, and the other is ology, which we've seen before, words about. So words about the end, or thoughts about the end, or ideas about the end. But the end of what? Well, there's two main kinds of eschatology. Theologians and philosophers speak of personal eschatology, and this is concerned with what happens to me when I die, or you. But then there's general eschatology, which is what's going to happen to everything. What will happen to the world or the universe? How is it going to end? And is there anything after that? Is there a judgment? Is there reincarnation? What does reincarnation actually mean? Is it a reward or is it a punishment? Different traditions come down on this in kind of different ways. Let's talk about afterlife first. There are traditions who say that there is an afterlife, and there are traditions that say that there is no afterlife. Let's look at those. Now, native traditions, of course, are always hard to pin down, because some traditions say there is, and some traditions say there aren't. But the further you go back, the less evidence there is of a theology of an afterlife. If you think about the native Greek tradition, for instance, you have the realm of Hades, which is where the spirits go after their life on earth is done. And Hades is a temporary place. It is the place where the shades or the ghosts of people who have been formerly alive go, and they eventually fade out as the people on earth who remember them also pass on. And so there is an idea of afterlife, but it isn't really an enduring afterlife. It's kind of an in-between place where a person goes from being real to being not so real to not being really at all. Early Judaism is very similar. They had a theology of a place very similar to Hades called Sheol, and the same thing happened. This is the place where souls go after they die. They have a shadowy kind of existence, and eventually they just fade out. In Taoism, there is not really a sense of an enduring afterlife. People are, and then they're not. Shamanistic Taoism, of course, has a variety of heavens and hells, but philosophical Taoism, ancient Taoism, not so much. Buddhism, I put kind of right in the middle between afterlife and no afterlife, because you have to ask the question, afterlife for what? In all areas of Buddha, in all varieties of Buddhism, the self is a fictitious construct. So the idea that a self would survive death is one of the things that the Buddha taught against. The word nirvana simply means snuffed out. What is it that is snuffed out? Well, that answer kind of differs from one school of Buddhism to another. In Theravada Buddhism, a person's life just ends. Now, there is an idea of reincarnation, but what passes from one life to another isn't really a person's personality. It is more just handing on one's karma to the next aggregate being who is going to pick it up and carry it. And so living a life in which one does not rack up very much karma is actually an act of compassion for the next being that is going to pick up your karma and run with it. Looking at later Judaism now, Judaism picked up a lot of ideas about the afterlife from Zoroastrianism during the Babylonian exile, and imported from Zoroastrianism ideas about heaven and hell. But those ideas later got downplayed. They're still part of Jewish mythology, but are not really emphasized. And so I put it like Buddhism, kind of in the middle of this because it is a part of the tradition, but not one that you hear very much about. There's a Jewish saying that goes, "Be faithful to God in this life, and God will be faithful to you in the next life. More than this, you don't need to know." Judaism is rather ambiguous on the question of whether there is an afterlife or not. Certainly, Judaism is, as a religion, is not about the afterlife. It is, in fact, about the survival of the people of Israel right here on earth. If we ask this same question of Hinduism, we're edging towards there being an afterlife, because certainly there is something of the personality that goes on and is carried on by the next life. What is difficult about this notion is that both this life and the next life are both illusory lives. If everything in the end is God, then the fact that we are here at all is Maya, is illusion. And the fact that my life gets reincarnated into another life is illusion as well. So if we want to at least to posit the relative reality of these succeeding lives, well then, yes, there is an idea of afterlife. But here we get into reincarnation as a good thing or a not so good thing. For Wiccan traditions and neo-paganism in general, they do believe in an afterlife, and because life is good and the earth is good, then we continue to reincarnate on this good earth, and this is a reason for joy and celebration. But in Hinduism, coming back again and again is not really seen as such a good thing. The desire is to be free from the endless cycle of birth and rebirth. Now, solidly in the camp of there being an afterlife is Zoroastrianism, which arguably is the place where all of this afterlife stuff got its start. Certainly, heaven and hell, as Western concepts of afterlife, have their origin in Zoroastrianism, and this is where later Judaism, Christianity, and Islam picked it up from, or at least we inherited it from the Zoroastrians. And so Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Islam all heartily affirm that there is an afterlife.
What do you think happens when you die?
I think you see through the illusion of the world. You realize your essential oneness with all things, and then they give you ice cream.
I think we come back with something better if we're good, or we come back with something worse if we're bad.
I think everyone goes to heaven. Everyone. Even my evil Uncle Charles, who pulls my hair out by the roots whenever I see him. I think in heaven, he'll realize that was a bad thing.
I think you're all wimps. When you die, you go into the ground and become worm food. No heaven, no next life, no ice cream. So, do you guys want to head out and, do something really dangerous?
Now let us move from our discussion of personal eschatology, what happens to me or you when we die, and talk about what happens to everything at the end. Is the world or the universe finite, or is it infinite? Is it eternal? As you might expect, different traditions have different ideas on these questions. For native traditions, the world has a definite beginning and it has a definite end. For Zoroastrianism, also, Ahura Mazda, the wise god, made the world, and there will be an end. In fact, all of history is going to culminate in this enormous giant battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. Much Zoroastrian literature is apocalyptic, and in fact, this is where apocalyptic literature gets its start. Everything in Zoroastrianism is pointed towards this one final conflagration. Judaism picks up, as we have seen, a number of ideas from Zoroastrianism, and this idea of a climactic battle at the end of time is one of them. But also the idea that the world is simply going to have an end, or at least the world as we know it is going to have an end, is something that Judaism affirms. Christianity, as the child of Judaism, also affirms this, and so does Islam. Hinduism is very interesting in that while the universe will come to an end, the deity, whether that deity is Shiva or Vishnu, does not. So in the Vishnaic version of things, Vishnu, who is the great vision of God, or version of God, is sleeping, and out of his navel is growing a lotus. And sitting on this lotus is Brahma, the creator. Every time Brahma opens his eyes, a world comes into being. And not just a world, but a universe. It comes into being. And that universe will last for millions of years. But eventually, Brahma will close his eyes and that universe will come to an end. Now remember, Vishnu, the great god, is sleeping. And so all of this is the dream of Vishnu. But it's cyclic. Brahma will open his eyes, Brahma will close his eyes, and Brahma will open his eyes again. And so, whereas every world has a beginning and an end, the succession of beginnings and endings have no end. On the Shaivite side of things, it's very, very similar. The universe is the dance of Shiva. So Shiva dances, and the universe spins out for millions of years. But then Shiva rests, and the universe comes to an end. But then, after he's rested, Shiva dances again, and so on and so on. And the world goes on in endless and eternal cycles. Buddhism, likewise, has a cyclic view of the world. The different ages of the world are called kalpas, and they continue in eternal succession. In Taoism, the world is truly seen as eternal. It has no beginning, and it has no end. It is simply an endless succession of seasons, one after another. Well, let's see what you think about the end of things. So, write one paragraph about how you understand the end. What happens to us when we die? What do you expect will happen to you? Is the universe eternal, or does it have a beginning and an ending? And what do you think is most important? This life or the next?
We'll be spending a lot more time on eschatology, the study of the end of things, in our upcoming modules.
So stay tuned.
So let's turn to a very large area of spiritual exploration, and that is spiritual growth, or as we name it in theological terms, formation. How are we formed as spiritual beings? Are there discrete stages that people move through? as we become more spiritually mature? What does a spiritually immature person look like versus a spiritually mature person? Well, of course, lots of traditions have different ideas about this. Now, we've been, up to this time, charting the range of possibilities on continua, but for this subject, I'd like to take a slightly different perspective. I'd like to take a more comparative perspective and go in a little deeper. Let's take a look at how Hinduism views spiritual growth first. So we're going to use the map that's provided in the Yoga Sutras. First of all, there is the stage of self-restraint. That means that people try to avoid violence and lying, try to avoid covetousness or theft, and also, as you'll see here, no sex. But I think that probably means no sex outside of one's covenants. Although certainly historically in Hinduism, it might have meant a much more ascetical kind of lifestyle. The next stage then is religious commitment, a commitment to purity in one's inner life and one's outer life, a commitment to being content with what one has, a commitment to doing ascetic practices and building tapas or spiritual power, a commitment to study and to worship, to surrendering oneself completely to God. The next stage is body and mind integration. This is very similar to the practice of Hatha Yoga, of doing postures and poses that align the body and at the same time discipline the mind. The next series of stages are regulation of breath, also the withdrawal from the senses, building strength by removing one's awareness from illusory distractions. And then concentration, really basic meditation skills. And then, of course, as people advance in meditation, becoming more adept at this and involving a dispassionate observation of the mind leading to complete mental quietude. And finally, this would lead someone to enlightenment, samadhi, which in its early stages might be a blissful awareness, but in later stages would be completely an undifferentiated awareness, a complete lostness in the divine. Now, what's interesting about these stages is that they break down into three basic categories. The first three are stages of moral preparation. How do I prepare myself as a spiritual being to progress on this path? What do I have to do as far as my outward life is concerned? Then the next series of 4 stages are spiritual practice. So these would be spiritual disciplines or interior preparation. And then, of course, the final stage would be breakthrough, which is enlightenment or the experience of union with the divine. Let's compare this to Buddhism. Buddhism also has a sequence of stages, usually stated within the Noble Eightfold Path. So the first 2 stages are right understanding, which involves intellectual study, good teaching, doctrine, or as the Buddhists say, Dharma. The second stage is right intention. In other words, what are my motivations? The third stage is right speech. In other words, no lying. Sowing division is also bad. Verbal abuse or gossip, not okay. The fourth stage is right action or right conduct. In other words, no killing, no stealing, no getting drunk, and no sexual impropriety. And 5, right livelihood. How we make our living is important. So, if you are walking a Buddhist path, you don't want to do any kind of work that is going to hurt anybody else. So no selling weapons, no selling liquor or poison, no killing animals, no cheating people. So card sharks, not for the Buddhist path is not for you. Also, no slavers are invited to this party. The 6th stage then is right effort. This is a kind of mindfulness practice. And then right mindfulness, which is attention to the body, to the feelings, to the mind, and to our mental qualities. Finally, the 8th stage is right concentration, which is the cultivation of subtle states of awareness that lead ultimately to enlightenment. Of course, many of these have substages as well, but this will do for our purposes right now. Now, let's take a step back and see if we see any similarities between the Buddhist roadmap to spiritual growth and the Hindu roadmap to spiritual growth. Well, indeed. Buddhism gives us a preparatory stage of educational preparation that Hinduism didn't. But from there on out, it's very, very similar. We've got moral preparation, and then spiritual practice, and finally, breakthrough. Let's move to a tradition from the West and see what we see then. Let's look at the mystical tradition of spiritual growth in Christianity. This comes out of very early Christian tradition and was developed and utilized extensively by many of the Christian mystics throughout the Middle Ages. The first stage is purgation. This is really a stage of discernment, and it has 2 substages. One stage is detachment. This is a time when one evaluates all the things in one's life and figures out what is congruent with one's spiritual path or one's aspirations, the kind of person that one wants to be, and keeps the things that are congruent, but lets go of the things that aren't. The next stage then is mortification, or substage rather, and this is a stage in which one looks at all one's behaviors, one's actions, and says, is this behavior congruent with the kind of person that I want to be, the kind of person I aspire to be, the kind of person that God is calling me to be. And then letting go of those behaviors and ways of being that are not congruent, while cultivating those behaviors and ways of being that really are. The second stage is illumination. And another word for this is enjoyment. It is through the use of meditation and other spiritual practices, becoming aware of God's presence wherever one is. The first substage of this is an awareness that God is in all things, whether those things are inanimate or animate, whether they're in people or animals or trees or rocks or flowers, that God is there in all things. A later stage of this is kind of a big shift where one realized that not only is God in all things, but all things are in God. That, in fact, the entire universe is held within God, and so there's no way that one can even escape God's presence. The third stage, then, is union, which is a stage of extreme and radical commitment. The first stage is a kind of a unitive abiding. It is one where one becomes aware that that the self and God are one being, and it is spoken about by the mystics as a deeply kind of romantic kind of experience of oneness, like marriage. But it goes deeper, because it isn't just two people who are living together, but two people, two beings that become one being. And this leads us to the final stage or substage of union, which is unitive action, which is where the soul, the person, and God become so united that when God desires to act, the person acts. That this is the awareness that when Saint Teresa said, Jesus has no hands on earth but ours, that when God desires to reach out and help, that it is our hand that reaches out. So we, in fact, are being possessed by God and being used by God and being lived through by God's life. Now, what does it look like when we take a step back and look at this model? Well, amazing. We see a very interesting thing. We see moral preparation in purgation, we see spiritual practice there in illumination, and we see breakthrough of unitive consciousness in union, just like we see in Hinduism and Buddhism. So if we take a look at these four stages by themselves, independent of the traditions, I'm going to put the wisdom preparation in parentheses because I don't think there's any tradition that would disagree with this. Whether it's Hinduism or Christianity or just about any other tradition you can name, good, solid spiritual teaching before one begins the path is important. And then, of course, the moral preparation, the spiritual practice, and hopefully the eventual breakthrough, if a person has been diligent and really working it. Another way to think about these concepts for us today is wisdom preparation is spiritual study. Moral preparation is really about alignment. Alignment of all the things in one's life and one's behaviors with one's spiritual vision, with the kind of spirituality, the kind of spiritual qualities that a person values and wants to become like. And then spiritual practice, I think another good word for this is spiritual discipline. I think this is a good word for us today because we're not really very good at discipline. So whereas spiritual practice has a great ring to it, spiritual discipline, I think, is a help to us because it reminds us that the spiritual path is not always an easy one, and it requires a great deal of effort to make the kind of progress that we want to make in order to reach number 4, breakthrough. And another way of thinking about breakthrough is about a complete identification with the larger S self. This is a disidentification with our small s self, our ego, and a re-identification with a larger self. And of course, every tradition views this larger self in another way. So for native traditions, this larger self would be nature. For Hinduism, the larger self would be God, Brahman. For Buddhism, the larger self would be all that is, all of being, or Buddha nature. For Judaism, the larger self might be the people of Israel. For Islam, it might be the Ummah, the just society that Allah is calling us to build. For Christianity, that larger self is Christ, and so on and so on. Whatever we call the larger self, the spiritual process is very much the same. Let's take a look at how psychologists, or in this instance, one psychologist, views spiritual growth. Now, James Fowler is a developmental psychologist who has spent his lifetime studying faith development, and he has developed what he calls a faith development theory in his incredible, groundbreaking book, Stages of Faith. If you haven't read it yourself, I would say rush out in a buying frenzy and get this book because you will not be sorry. It is quite an impressive and important work. But let's review very quickly the 6 stages of spiritual growth that he outlines. And they're very different from the stages that our spiritual traditions give us. Nevertheless, it is very insightful, and I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't make a number of connections to your own spiritual journey and your own life. Let's take a look at the different stages of faith that James Fowler outlines in his theory. First of all, there is stage 0, or primal, undifferentiated faith. This is the stage of faith that people fall into who are between birth and 2 years old. And it's characterized by learning about how safe the environment is. Is the environment warm? Is it safe and secure? Or is it hurtful or neglectful or dangerous? Stage 1, then, he calls intuitive projective faith. This usually occurs between the ages of 3 and 7. And it is characterized by what he calls the psyche's unprotected exposure to the unconscious. This is a stage in which the imagination runs wild. It's a stage in which logic doesn't really have a lot of pull, and kind of doesn't need to. It's the first step in a person's self-awareness. It's also the stage in which a person absorbs a lot of one's culture's taboos. It's also kind of a dangerous stage, though, in that a child's imagination can really run away with him or her, and unrestrained images of terror or destruction can arise from the unconscious. There's also a danger of kind of extremist indoctrination at this point as well, because this is the stage in which a person's worldview is really has really begun to be formed. The next stage, stage 2, is mythic literal faith. And this is the stage that you find most school children in. This is a stage in which symbol and ritual start to be integrated by the child. The symbols, though, are not three-dimensional, they're kind of one-dimensional. They're very literal interpretations of what they're told, of the stories, of the myths, of the metaphors and symbols. In fact, they're not likely to be seen as metaphors. The runaway imagination of the previous stage is starting to be harnessed a little bit, and a child begins to think in a much more linear fashion. In stage 2, a person becomes aware of the justice of the universe and becomes is often a great believer in the justice of the universe. The divine is almost always seen in anthropomorphic terms. It's also very difficult for someone at this stage to see that the symbols and metaphors are symbols and metaphors. They take things very literally. Most people, however, move on to stage 3, which Fowler calls synthetic conventional faith. Now, actually, most of the population finds their permanent home in this stage. It usually arises in adolescence, and this is a stage in which one really forms one's worldview to the degree that one, forms a paradigm or a world in which one can function in as an adult. It is a stage that is very interested in conformity. One understands one's own identity by aligning oneself with the perspective of the people around one. It is a stage in which ideology is very, very important, and the uncritical acceptance of ideology is very, very important. So one might be given an ideology, one integrates that ideology, but one doesn't realize that it's an ideology. For that person, that is just the world, and it's just the way that the world is. It's difficult to get the critical distance, the internal critical distance from how one believes the world to be at this stage. Authority in this stage is almost always from the top down. But some people will move on to what Fowler calls stage 4, individuative and reflective faith. Now, this is not a happy stage generally. It's a stage that involves an awful lot of personal struggle, a lot of pain and angst, in fact, because this is the stage in which a person really wrestles with his or her own identity and belief. People usually pass into stage 4, if they ever pass into stage 4, in their mid-30s to early 40s. So at this time, a person gains this interior reflective distance and basically takes a step back and says, hey, wait a minute, is this stuff really true? Because there are things that don't make sense, and there are things that seem contradictory. Of course, in stage 3, a person glosses over these things, but in stage 4, a person really starts asking the hard questions. And the old answers don't suffice anymore. The pat answers that are given just don't hold water, and so a person really begins to think for him or herself. This is a stage of demythologizing, where things that were once questioned, were once unquestioned, are now really scrutinized and really subjected to critical thinking. This is a very existential stage where a person is really kind of wrapped up in one's own disillusionment of the worldview that he or she has held. It's a very difficult stage, but also a very, very important one. It's kind of the, hey, wait a minute stage that's so important if a person is going to progress any further. And thankfully, people often do. They go on to stage 5, which Fowler calls conjunctive faith. In stage 5, a person moves from stage 4's rationalism and critical examination of everything to a point where a person becomes much more comfortable with paradox. So in this stage, a person might go back to the metaphors and the symbols that he or she received in childhood, but knows them to be metaphors and symbols now that are pointing to a greater mystery that is ultimately incomprehensible and unknowable by the human mind. Therefore, one sees one's myths and symbols and metaphors as useful tools that point towards this mystery. But also the metaphors and the stories and the symbols of other peoples and other faith traditions are also pointing towards this mystery and are equally useful tools. So a person transcends one's previous worldview in this and is able to, at the same time, re-sacralize the world, to see it again as a sacred place. But this time, holding the symbols and the metaphors and the dogma and the doctrine and the religious aspect of things in a much more light way. One doesn't take these things literally, but sees them as much more charged metaphors that are useful towards pointing towards someone towards transcendence, towards mystery, towards the unknowable source of all things. It is an overwhelming and ecstatic stage where one once again opens up to possibility and wonder. Finally, a person might move into universalizing faith, stage 6, although it's actually very, very rare. So this is the stage in which a person not only glimpses unitive reality, but actually abandons any sense of self-preservation. And so one becomes so wholly united with the mystery, so much possessed by the mystery that one spins oneself in the service of other people. You look at great saints and gurus and holy people who have really given their lives over to other people, such as, let's say, St. Francis or Gandhi, as being examples of this stage of spiritual growth. It is the home of the true mystic, for whom all paths are valid paths, and the divine is both immanent and transcendent. So we've looked at a lot of stages of spiritual growth in this section, but are they really stages? I mean, does spiritual growth really happen in a linear fashion like this? Well, that's really very much open to interpretation. And in fact, some people would argue that, yes, they are in fact linear stages, but others would argue that they're cyclic, that we go through these stages again and again, and each time we deepen into them, and they become more and more integrated and more a part of us. My own perspective on this is that we are in all stages at all times, but different stages are pronounced at different parts of our lives. But, you know, all of this is open to interpretation, and you probably have your own ideas on this. Another polarity that we can talk about in examining how we grow spiritually is the question of internal authority or external authority. You know, who gets to say what is right or what is proper in the life of faith? Is this something that we discover within ourselves, or is it a top-down thing? Is it something that that is told to us by others that we integrate? For some people, this is going to differ depending on what stage of the spiritual path he or she is on. Internal authority, another way of thinking of that is authenticity. You know, is what we're growing into really our true self? And is that the highest aspiration of the spiritual life? Or is the highest aspiration of spiritual life actually conformity? Now, those who value internal authority are going to usually value authenticity or growth into one's unique expression of being. Whereas people who value external authority are more likely going to value conformity, of shaping one's own life in terms of the spiritual ideal that is put forward by the spiritual tradition.
I think a spiritually mature person is focused on others. A spiritually immature person is self-centered.
Yeah, I can see that. But I'd say that a person who was mature, spiritually, is obedient to those in authority. An immature person is rebellious and just does his own thing.
You want to know what I think? I think a spiritually immature person needs other people to do things for him. A spiritually mature person is self-reliant and independent.
Come on, Bob. I just cut your steak up into the itty-bitty bites you like. Come and get it while it's hot.
Let's stop for a minute and hear from you. I'd like to know what you think about spiritual growth. So take a few minutes and write a sentence or two about each of the following. What is a spiritually immature person like? How does this person behave? What does this person look or act like? What does a spiritually mature person look like? And how is he or she different from a spiritually immature person? What kind of moral preparation have you done on your spiritual path? And what kind of spiritual discipline do you practice? And finally, if you've had a breakthrough experience, briefly describe what it was like.